A desperate father sends 4 letters to 4 strangers, offering his daughters to the highest bidder. Only one man answers. He rides through a storm, steps into a rotting parlor, and watches the father parade his beautiful eldest daughter like a prize horse. Then he asks one question that changes everything. What about the other one? The girl in the shadows, the one with mud under her nails, the one nobody ever chose. But what she doesn't know is, his first wife didn't leave him. She's buried under the oak tree out back, and the man who put her there is waiting just 10 miles down the road. Welcome to Western Twilight, where the wind carries tales of fierce love, unbreakable hearts, and the kind of courage that doesn't arrive on horseback but grows quiet and steady from scorched earth. If you've ever felt invisible and wondered if anyone would ever truly see you, this is your place. This story reminds us that real strength was never about carrying the weight alone. It's about letting someone stand beside you, even when you're terrified they'll see the parts of you that aren't brave at all, and that the deepest love doesn't rescue you. It opens a door and trusts you to walk through it yourself. If Hannah's story lit something inside you, hit that subscribe button and ride this trail with us. There are more voices out here the world tried to silence. Leave a like, drop a comment, and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and share this with someone who's been standing in the shadows way too long. Sometimes a single story is the only hand that can reach through the dark and remind someone you were never meant to be invisible.
The rain came down hard like it had a score to settle. It beat against the roof of the Whitmore place, though calling it a proper estate anymore was stretching the truth. It had been a proud home once. Big painted columns, fences that stood straight and tall, shutters that hung right. Now the columns were peeling like a man after a week in the sun. The shutters hung as crooked as a politician's promise, and the fences just leaned on each other, staying up more out of habit than strength. Inside, Gerald Whitmore paced the front room with the restless energy of a man who had run out of road 6 months ago. "He is late?" Gerald yanked his watch from his vest for the 5th time in 5 minutes. "Mercer said he would be here by sundown." "Well, the sun is down. It is pouring rain, Father." Lydia Whitmore's voice was calm, the voice of a daughter who learned a long time ago not to poke a desperate man. She sat by the fire, her back straight as a board, her hands folded in her lap like she was posing for a painting. And in a way she was. She had taken 3 hours to get ready. The blue silk dress was a perfect match for her eyes. Her blonde hair was curled just so. She had dabbed rose water on her neck and wrists. She was meant to look like she was worth a fortune. That was the entire point. "Rain or no rain," Gerald shot back, "a man of his word keeps it. If he fails to show, we are ruined. The bank is not waiting past November, and November is already knocking at our door." Hannah Whitmore stood in the doorway connecting the parlor to the kitchen, not quite in the room, but not quite out of it either. It was a place she had learned to occupy perfectly over her 22 years, close enough to be useful, but out of sight enough to be ignored. She was wearing a brown dress. She almost always wore brown or gray. They were colors that did not show dirt, did not stain, and did not catch anyone's eye. Her dark hair was tied back in a simple, practical bun. Her hands were clean, but her fingernails were cut short for working, and you could still see a faint line of mud under them from when she was out reinforcing the chicken coop an hour earlier. "Hannah." "The tea." Gerald snapped his fingers without even looking at her. "And make sure it is hot. And for the love of all that is good, you stay in the kitchen when he gets here. Lydia will do the pouring." "Yes, Father." She turned and walked toward the kitchen, a familiar disappointment settling deep in her chest, heavy like an old piece of furniture you no longer notice. Earlier that night, while taking the trash to the burn barrel, Hannah had discovered something that made her feel sick to her stomach. It was a crumpled-up letter in her father's own handwriting. Actually, it was not just one letter. There were 4 of them. 4 almost identical letters mailed to 4 different men scattered across the Western territories. Each letter offered the exact same deal: 2 daughters and a failing property that needed a savior. 3 of those men never sent a word back. Caleb Mercer was the only one who answered. Her father was not weighing his options. He was just grabbing the one and only rope that had been thrown to him. As Hannah walked by, Lydia caught her eye. For a split second, a look of what might have been pity crossed her sister's flawless face. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that bright, hopeful smile she'd been practicing in the mirror. "If he chooses me," Lydia whispered, "I swear I will send money back for you." Hannah stopped and looked right at her sister. "If he chooses you, just promise me you will find a way to survive him." A heavy, unspoken understanding passed between them. Then Hannah slipped into the kitchen with the teapot, and Lydia turned back to the fire. And both sisters sat there, waiting for the sound that was about to change their entire lives. A crack of thunder shook the house so hard that the windows rattled in their frames. And then, cutting through the sound of the rain, they heard the unmistakable sound of a horse. Gerald stopped pacing in the middle of the floor. Lydia's hands immediately went to her hair, smoothing down curls that were already perfect. Hannah stepped further back into the shadows of the kitchen doorway, feeling the warmth of the teapot against her side. When the knock came, it was not timid. It was solid and deliberate. It was the knock of a man who expected doors to open for him. Gerald straightened his vest, put on a dignified expression, and swung the front door open. Caleb Mercer stood on the porch, looking like he was carved out of the storm itself. He was a tall man, well over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they filled the entire doorway. His hands were huge, with scars across the knuckles, and they looked like they had spent a lot more time holding horse reins than fine china. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat and the hem of his coat, making a small puddle at his feet. He could have been 40, maybe older. He was weathered by the sun in a way that made his age hard to pin down. His face was all sharp lines, with a jaw that looked strong enough to break rope, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky. They were pale, cold, and they seemed to take in everything in a single, quick glance. He did not smile. He did not. "Mr. Whitmore?" His voice was low and deep, rough from years of yelling orders across wide-open country. "Mr. Mercer." Gerald's reply was a little too loud, a little too cheerful, like a lantern flame turned up too high. "Please do come in. Out of this weather, it is a terrible night to be on the road. I have ridden through worse," Caleb said as he stepped inside and took off his hat. His eyes scanned the room in one smooth motion. He saw the faded curtains, the worn-out rug, and the fire in the hearth that was losing its battle against the damp chill. He seemed to take note of every sign of hardship, the way a man reads the lay of the land, searching for the truth that lies beneath the surface. Then his gaze fell upon Lydia. She stood up from her chair, and the firelight shimmered on her silk dress. Her smile was warm, welcoming, and perfectly rehearsed. "Mr. Mercer, it is an honor to meet you. I am Lydia Whitmore." She held out her hand with a graceful flourish. Caleb took it, gave a single nod, and then let it go without another word. Hannah watched from the shadows, still holding the teapot, as her father began the speech he had clearly been practicing for weeks. He talked about the Whitmore family legacy, 2,000 acres of prime grazing land, timber rights, and access to water. He mentioned some temporary financial setbacks and the need for a fresh injection of capital, a new partner. Caleb just listened, his face showing no emotion at all. Then he placed the teacup Lydia had poured for him back on its saucer. The sound of the china clicking together seemed to put an end to the conversation. "You are out of money," Caleb stated plainly, "and I need a wife. Your letter was straightforward enough about the terms, so let us not waste time. Which one of your daughters are you selling?" The bluntness of the question made Gerald flinch, but he quickly recovered. "Well, naturally I assumed you would find Lydia to be the most suitable. She is well versed in all the domestic arts. She is skilled in needlework, music, and household management. She speaks French and corresponds with the most prominent families in the county, and—" "I did not ask for a list of her accomplishments," Caleb cut him off. "I asked which one you are selling." The silence in the room was thick enough to choke on. Gerald's practiced smile grew tight. "Mr. Mercer, I understand that business on the frontier is perhaps more direct than what we are accustomed to here in Virginia, but I must assure you, Virginia is 3 weeks behind me, and I have a ranch that will not run on its own. Caleb leaned forward slightly. I came all this way because your letter said you had a daughter who is willing to move west. I need a woman who knows how to work, not one who knows how to play the piano. So I will ask you one more time. Which daughter is it? And what do you want for her? Gerald's face turned a deep shade of red, and he started listing Lydia's good qualities again, like a man reading from a sales catalog. Caleb cut him off with the same flat question every time. Can she mend a fence line? Can she pull a calf when it is stuck? Can she butcher a chicken for dinner? Does she know how to treat a horse for colic? With every question, Lydia's perfect composure began to crumble. She looked at her father, completely at a loss for words. What about the other one? Caleb asked. Every head in the room turned toward Hannah. She could feel their stares on her like a physical weight. Caleb walked across the room, his boots making heavy thuds on the worn wooden floor. He stopped about 3 feet in front of her, close enough to make her want to take a step back. But she stood her ground. You have been mighty quiet, he said. I was not invited to speak, Mr. Mercer. A hint of what might have been respect flickered in his pale eyes. I'm inviting you now. Can you mend a fence? Yes, sir. Are we talking wire or post and rail? Can you pull a calf? I have pulled 6, lost only one of them. Can you slaughter a chicken? I dress 20 every week to sell at the market in town. The shift of his focus was so complete you could almost feel it in the air. It was like watching a compass needle swing around and lock onto true north. Who was it that reinforced the west supports on that barn? He asked. I saw the fresh work when I was riding in. It is solid work. Well done. Gerald practically stumbled over his own words. I brought a fella in to see to... I did it. The sound of Hannah's voice sliced through her father's fibbing cleaner than a new knife. She had never once talked over him, not in all her 22 years. But the way this man looked right through you, asking straight questions and waiting on straight answers, well, it broke something loose inside her. I did it. This past summer, all by myself. The silence that fell on the room was thick enough to stand on. That is when Gerald's hand flew, a hard, open palm right across Hannah's face. Her head snapped to the side. She tasted blood where her teeth had split the inside of her lip. She stood there stock still, the coppery tang mixing with something else entirely. A taste that felt like the very end of a long, tired road. Gerald's voice was shaking with pure fury. You will hold your tongue in my house. You will not make a liar out of... He didn't get to finish. Caleb Mercer got to his feet. Sir. Nice and slow. The whole room seemed to get smaller as he closed the distance to Gerald. He put a scarred hand on the older man's shoulder and gave it a squeeze. It was not a friendly gesture. It was the kind of grip that explained without a single word what the next one would do. His voice was low, hardly more than a whisper. You do that again, I will break your hand. That is not some idle threat, Mr. Whitmore. Where I come from, we call that a promise. Gerald turned pale as a ghost. Lydia slapped a hand over her mouth, and Hannah just stood there with blood on her lip and a fire in her eyes, watching this stranger, this walking thunderstorm, choose to hold back for her. She saw that his hands were trembling, not from rage, but from the sheer effort it took not to do more. And right then, Hannah understood something about Caleb Mercer that her daddy and her sister would never get. He was not in control because he was a calm man. He was in control because he was a dangerous one. And the fact he chose to leash that danger for her, well, that meant something she wasn't quite ready to put a name to. Caleb let go of Gerald. He took a step back. He settled his hat on his head. I will sleep in your barn tonight. I will take 3 days to look over your operation, and then I will make my decision. He gave a nod to the two sisters. Ladies. And with that, he walked right out into the storm. The second that door clicked shut, Gerald came undone. He laid all the blame on Hannah. He struck her again, a harder blow across the ribs where the bruise would not be seen. He told her to make herself scarce, to keep her mouth shut, and to stay in the kitchen where a woman ought to be. Hannah took it. She had been taking it her whole life, but a deep shift had happened inside her, like the ground cracking open after a hard freeze. And she knew, sure as the sun would rise, that she was done taking it. That night, long after Gerald had drunk himself into a stupor and Lydia had disappeared into her room, Hannah stood by herself at the parlor window. Through the sheeting rain, she could make out the flicker of a lantern in the barn. Caleb Mercer, choosing to sleep with the horses instead of sitting at her father's table. A man whose own hands shook from the strain of keeping himself in check. A man who had looked at her and asked what she could do, not how pretty she was while she was doing it. Her cheek was throbbing. Her ribs sent a sharp ache with every breath. And deep down in her chest, as dangerous as a loaded pistol, a feeling stirred that she recognized with the sharp instinct of a woman who had learned to spot trouble from a young age. It was hope, the most dangerous feeling of all, because Caleb Mercer was carrying secrets. She had seen them flash in those winter-gray eyes like heat lightning on a distant horizon. There one moment and gone the next. And Hannah Whitmore, who had made it through 22 years by learning to read what folks tried to keep hidden, knew one thing for certain. Whatever Caleb Mercer was running from, it was a whole lot worse than what she was running toward. Caleb was wide awake. It was not the scratchy straw, or the chill in the air, or the sound of the horses stirring in their stalls. It was because every time he shut his eyes, he saw two different bruises. The one starting to bloom on Hannah Whitmore's cheek tonight, and the one that had shadowed Margaret's jaw 7 years ago, the morning before he left for Helena, the morning it all went wrong. He had done nothing about Margaret's bruise. It was not from a man's fist. She had walked into the barn door, she told him. Just clumsy, she had said. But Caleb had seen the look in Crane's foreman's eyes at the supply depot a week earlier. He had seen how the man stood between Margaret and the only way out. He had seen it all and done nothing, because he had cattle to buy and a ranch to build, and he figured Margaret was tough enough to handle her own business. Crane's men showed up 12 hours after Caleb rode out. He would live with that arithmetic for the rest of his days. One bruise he chose to ignore. One woman he lost forever. He would not make that same mistake twice. The plain truth was, Caleb needed a wife for reasons that had nothing to do with being lonely. Silas Crane, the man who owned the ranch 10 miles to the east, was using territorial homestead laws to make a claim on Caleb's water rights. The law favored a married man with a family household over a single bachelor. Caleb needed a wife like a fort needs a high wall. It was not about comfort. It was about survival. He had told himself it was just a business move, nothing more to it. But seeing Hannah Whitmore take that slap without so much as a flinch, seeing her stand there with a bloody lip and pure defiance in her eyes, Caleb felt something break open inside him that he thought he had sealed up for good 7 years back. He shoved the feeling down deep, buried it right alongside Margaret, underneath dirt and silence and the kind of shame that can eat a man alive from the inside. The dawn came in cold and gray. Hannah was already in the barn before the sun was up. She did not spot Caleb at first, sitting quiet in the shadows of the last stall, with a curry comb sitting idle in his hand. She went about her morning chores with a practiced, steady rhythm, gathering eggs, slopping the hogs, checking the water troughs. Every move she made was sure and steady. "Your father hit you." She froze. Her hand tightened on the bucket handle. She did not turn to face him. He was just upset, she said, choosing her words with care, about the arrangement not going the way he had it planned. "Because I paid mine to the wrong daughter. Because you paid mine at all, Mr. Mercer. Most men would have just taken my father's word for it, signed the papers, and been on their way. I am not most men. I am starting to see that." They just looked at each other there in the dim light of the barn. Something passed between them. It was not attraction, not yet anyway, but it was a kind of knowing. The way two people who have been through the ringer can look at each other and understand, without a word being said, the kind of weight the other is carrying. For the next 3 days, Caleb put both daughters to the test. the same way a man will test a piece of land before he buys it. He was not cruel about it, but he had the clear, practical eye of a man who knew that staying alive often came down to what you could do with your own two hands when everything else had gone wrong. Gerald put on a whole show for Lydia. The green dress, a tour of the garden, the fancy flower arrangements, and the perfectly set table, and polite chatter about music and books and all the refined ways of high society. Caleb just watched it all with the kind of patience a man has when he is watching a storm he knows he cannot stop. His next stop was to find Hannah. She was always out there getting something done, mending a stretch of fence, mucking out the stalls, checking on the root cellar where the supplies were looking mighty grim. 3 whole barrels of potatoes were already turning soft, and there was only enough salt pork to get them to January, and that was if they sliced it paper thin. He spent 2 hours that first day just walking the property with her. For every tall tale Gerald told, Hannah set the record straight in her quiet way. The pastures had been empty for 3 years. The soil was plain worn out, and the timber rights were tied up in a 15-year contract that Gerald had somehow failed to recollect. She pointed out a creek that was running lower than it ought to be. The water level dropped about 2 years back, she told him. Something upriver changed. Father told me not to go looking, said it was no place for a woman. At that, Caleb's face went hard as stone. Who owns the land to the north of this place? I don't rightly know. Father keeps all them papers locked away in his study. Caleb filed that piece of information away and said nothing. But Hannah saw the muscle jump in his jaw. She saw how his gaze went far off for a second, like he'd just heard the name of a ghost whispered on the wind. On the second day, something happened that caught Caleb off guard. Lydia found him by himself near the south fence line and spoke to him without her father pulling the strings. "I know what you are about, Mr. Mercer. You are sizing us up like a man buying horses, and I know I am not winning. But I need you to understand one thing. I am not a weak woman. I was just raised to fight a different kind of battle. My weapons are charm and good conversation, not fence posts and livestock. That does not make them any less powerful. It just means they are no good to you." For the first time, Caleb looked at her with a flicker of real respect. "You are a whole lot smarter than your father thinks you are, Miss Whitmore. That is not a difficult mark to clear, Mr. Mercer." He almost cracked a smile. Almost. That night, Gerald struck Hannah again. He made sure Caleb was nowhere in sight this time. A hard blow across her ribs where the bruise would stay hidden under her dress. Hannah wrapped her own ribs with strips of old cloth that night, her hands steady as a rock even as a firestorm of pure rage burned right through her. She just swallowed it down, like she had every other time. Not yet, she told herself. Not in this place. On the morning of the third day, Caleb found Hannah up in the barn loft, hammering a loose floorboard back into place. He climbed the ladder and stood near enough for her to feel his body heat in the chilly air. "What is it you want, Hannah?" It was the first time he had used her first name. It shook her enough to make her look straight at him. "Sir, not what you have to do, not what you need. If you could have any life you wanted without a single limitation, what would you choose?" The question was so strange, she could hardly wrap her head around it. No one in her life had ever bothered to ask her what she wanted. They only asked what she could do, what she could patch up, what she could haul. "I would want to mean something," she said in a whisper. "Not because of what I can do for someone, but because somebody valued me for who I am." The silence that followed was thick and heavy with unspoken truths. Then Caleb finally spoke, and what he said was not sweet. It was not gentle. It was not romantic. "I require a wife for a legal matter. I have a water rights fight with a neighbor, and under the law in this territory, a married man's claim is stronger. I am picking you because you are tough enough for the work, and you will not break when life gets hard. I am not offering you a grand romance. I am offering you a fair shake, a true partnership, and half of every single thing we build from this day forward." Hannah let his words sink in. The raw honesty of it was almost too much to take. After a whole life built on pretty lies and empty promises, here was a man giving her the plain, unvarnished truth. "I accept," she said, "but I have one condition. Tell me. I have to know what happened to your first wife." The shift in Caleb was instant. It was like a heavy door slammed shut right behind his eyes. A wall went up, built from stone, all in the space of a single breath. "She left," he said flatly. "The frontier life was too hard for her. She went back to the east." He wouldn't look her in the eye when he said it. Hannah Whitmore had spent 22 years of her life learning to read the falsehoods on her father's face. She knew the sour taste of a lie the same way a horse knows spoiled water. And in that moment, Caleb Mercer was lying to her with his entire being. But she said yes anyway. Because any place was better than this one. Because a hard truth down the road was better than a sweet lie right now. Because she could see just behind that wall he was putting up the shape of something broken that looked a lot like the broken parts inside of her. "I will marry you, Caleb Mercer," she said, her voice a lot calmer than her own heartbeat. "But there is something you ought to know about me. I can handle the brutal truth. What I cannot handle is a gentle lie. And you are telling me one right now." He gave a short nod, but he still did not meet her gaze. And that one thing told Hannah everything she needed to know about the man she just promised her life to. He was honest about every single thing, except for the one thing that mattered most. Hannah Whitmore wore the only blue dress she owned to marry a man she barely knew. And the biggest feeling she had was not fear. It was relief. It felt like she had spent her whole life wearing a chain that was wrapped in velvet, and someone had finally come along and cut it with a sharp knife, instead of trying to cover it with flowers. The morning they made the announcement, Gerald Whitmore's anger was a storm in the house. It filled up the parlor like thick smoke, stealing the air from your lungs, turning his face a shade of purple as he clenched and unclenched his fists. "You scheming little thing," he hissed at Hannah. "That. Everything I had planned, all my arrangements, and you went and ruined it. You turned him against your own sister." Caleb moved to stand between Gerald and his daughters. He did not hurry, but his movement was final, like a fence post being driven deep into the hard Texas ground. "I was looking for a partner, Mr. Whitmore. You were trying to sell me property. There is a big difference." That is when Hannah found her own voice. And for the very first time in her life, she spoke to her father without a trace of fear or obedience. "I do not care about your money, Father. I never have. What I wanted was for you to notice me, to see my worth beyond just cleaning up the messes you made. But you never saw it, and you never will. That is why I am choosing a man who does." Gerald's jaw worked, but no words came out. Then Lydia, his beautiful Lydia, who had every right to be angry and ruined by how things turned out, came and stood by her little sister. They stood, shoulder to shoulder, a solid line against him. "She is telling you the truth, Father. You left us behind a long, long time ago, when the bottle became your friend, when you gambled away our future, when your own pride meant more than us having food on the table. Hannah is just the first one with the grit to walk away." Gerald stared at his daughters like he was seeing them for the very first time, or maybe the very last. Caleb stated his terms with the same calm, flat tone of a man settling the price on a herd of cattle. He would pay off Gerald's biggest debts, the note at the bank and the folks demanding their money now. It would be enough to give him 6 months to get his affairs in order. "That is more than you have earned," Caleb said. "And it is the only deal you are going to get. You will sign the paper for the marriage, and you will do it without any more drama. If you do not, I will ride out of here this morning, and you can try explaining to the bank in 60 days why they should have pity on you. It is your decision." Gerald signed the paper. His hand trembled so much that the ink smudged. He did not look at Hannah. He did not say a single word of goodbye. The wedding was short. It felt more like a business transaction. The town preacher asked the questions the law required and not a thing more. Gerald locked himself in his study with a whiskey bottle. Lydia stood right next to Hannah, squeezing her sister's hand as quiet tears streamed down her flawless face. When the preacher declared them married, Caleb placed a kiss on Hannah's forehead. It was a gesture that felt more like a promise than any kind of romance. She was now Hannah Mercer, no longer a Whitmore. She was no longer the forgotten daughter of a failing family and a father who had let everyone down. The goodbye between the sisters was the one thing that nearly broke Hannah's resolve. Lydia pushed their mother's embroidered handkerchief into Hannah's palm. Mama always said that a daughter who weeps at her own wedding will not have a reason to weep in her marriage. So let it out now, Hannah. Cry all your tears right here. And Hannah wept. For the very first time in her whole life, she let the tears fall without trying to stop them. She cried for her mother, who passed away in a cold house because her father was too broke to keep the fire going. She cried for the little girl she used to be, the one who thought her father was the tallest and strongest man in the whole world. She cried for Lydia, who was being left behind in a house that was going down like a sinking ship with nobody to steer it. Then Lydia leaned in close. Her whisper was hurried, almost drowned out by the sound of the men hitching the horses to the wagon. Father is hiding something. It is about the land just north of our property. I overheard him talking to a man. He said a name. Crane. I do not know what it is about, but please, Hannah, you have to be careful. Hannah tucked that name away in her mind, right next to the lie Caleb had told about Margaret. 2 secrets, 2 debts she fully planned on collecting. You be brave, Hannah whispered to her sister. Find your own escape. I will, Lydia promised. You have shown me the way. The trip west was 3 long weeks in a wagon, and then another week on the railroad. Through the train window, Hannah watched the world change. Gentle rolling hills flattened into plains that stretched on forever. Thick forests thinned out into wide open grassland. The sky just kept getting bigger and bigger with every mile until it seemed to cover everything. It was so vast and overwhelming and beautiful that it made her heart ache. Caleb sat there beside her. He would point out different landmarks along the way. He explained the lay of the land. He answered her questions about the ranch with the kind of direct honesty a man uses when he is talking about his business. But the moment the conversation shifted to anything personal, he would pull back behind that wall of his. It was a wall so solid and high, built out of something Hannah could not yet figure out. They were about 3 days past the Mississippi River when the highwayman found them. They were in a tight pass, winding through some low hills. Trees grew thick on both sides of the trail. It was the kind of place that makes the hair on your arms stand up with a deep-down sense of danger. Caleb had his hand on his rifle before Hannah even saw the 3 riders blocking their path. They were hard-looking men, and they were armed. These were not just some poor drifters looking for a meal. They were professionals who had picked this spot for a reason. Their leader lifted his hand, a smile on his face that never touched his cold eyes. Take it easy, Mercer. We are just here to collect a little road tax. A chill ran down Hannah's spine. The man knew Caleb's name. Caleb's expression turned to stone, into something Hannah had never seen before. It was not fear. It was recognition. And beneath that, a deep anger, pulled so tight she could see the muscles straining in his neck. Hannah moved before she had time to think. Their real money was carefully hidden, stitched into the lining of her travel bag and a secret pocket in her corset. It was a trick her mother had taught her, one that her own grandmother had used to get through the war. She grabbed the small coin purse she kept out in the open on purpose, which held only a few dollars for small purchases. She held it out, making sure her hands trembled. She did not have to pretend to be scared. Please, she said, her voice high and full of fear. This is everything we have. Please, just do not hurt us. The leader took the purse. He counted the few bills inside. He looked let down, but not shocked. Then he turned his horse to leave, and looking back over his shoulder, he delivered the words that changed everything. Send our best to your new wife, Mercer. We hope this one sticks around longer than the last one did. The bandits melted back into the trees. A heavy silence fell over the wagon, settling like dust after a cattle drive. Hannah's hands were still shaking, but when she spoke, her voice was perfectly level. They knew your name, and they knew about your first wife. Who were those men, Caleb? Just road agents. They are common enough in these parts. Road agents do not carry personal messages. Tell me who sent them. Caleb did not give an answer. His knuckles were white as he gripped the reins, and the quiet between them stretched out as tight as a newly strung fence wire. Hannah knew right then, with the kind of sharp insight that comes from a lifetime of reading dangerous men, that she had not just married a rancher, she had married into the middle of a war, and nobody had bothered to mention that before she said her vows. A week later, on their last night before reaching Montana, Hannah was woken from her sleep in a dark railroad hotel room by the sound of Caleb twisting in the bed beside her. He was calling out a name, Margaret. But it was not the way a man calls for a woman who has left him. He called it like a man watching someone die. He screamed it like you would scream at a wound that refuses to heal. The pain in his voice went far beyond being left alone, deeper than loneliness. It was a raw, terrible sound from the bottom of his soul. Hannah lay there completely still, listening. And she knew, as surely as she knew the sun would rise, that Margaret Mercer had not just gone back to Philadelphia. Margaret Mercer was dead, and whatever it was that had killed her was still out there, waiting for them in Montana. The train finally climbed over the last mountain pass the following afternoon, and the territory unfolded beneath them like a map of a new world. The mountains stood like jagged teeth against a sky that never ended. Grasslands rolled out to every horizon, a golden ocean without a shore. The wind slammed against the train windows with the force of something wild and alive, something that had never been tamed and had no intention of ever being so. Hannah pressed her hand to the cold window pane and thought about three things. A man who cried out a dead woman's name in his sleep. Outlaws who came to deliver messages from enemies she had not even met yet. And her sister's hushed warning. Crane. Somewhere out in all of that terrifying beauty, the answers were waiting for her. And Hannah Mercer planned on finding every last one of them. The Mercer Ranch was not beautiful in the way Hannah had ever thought of beauty. It was beautiful in the same way a good rifle is beautiful. Clean, simple, built for a single purpose. To last. They finally arrived on a cloudy afternoon in late November. Caleb reined the wagon to a halt on a small hill, and Hannah looked down at the valley where it all lay. There was a sturdy two-story house made of timber and stone, with smoke curling up from the chimney. The barns and other buildings were laid out with the precision of a military camp. Fences ran in straight, neat lines across the rolling fields, and off in the distance, she could see cattle moving like dark specks against the brown grass, at least 200 head of them. Everything about the place spoke of careful thought, constant upkeep. It was the work of a man who built things to stand the test of time and kept them going through pure force of will and endless hard work. There, Caleb said. His voice held a note of pride he hardly ever showed. Home. A man came out of the barn as they rode into the yard. He was tall and lean, about 45 years old, with a face weathered by the sun and eyes as sharp as a hawk's. He lifted a hand to greet them and walked over with long, sure strides. Boss, I was not looking for you for another couple of days. We made good time. Caleb set the wagon brake and hopped down. Hannah, this here is James Cooper. He is my foreman. Everybody just calls him Coupe. Coop, this is my wife, Mrs. Mercer. Cooper's eyebrows lifted just a fraction of an inch. It was the most surprise Hannah would ever see on that man's face. Ma'am. He gave a slight tip of his hat brim. Welcome to the ranch. Behind Coop, 7 other men had drifted out from near the bunkhouse to see the arrival. They were a mixed bunch, from a tough old-timer who chewed tobacco like it was his job, to a boy with a face full of freckles who was so young he looked like he could not decide whether to tip his hat or turn and run. The old-timer was the first to speak. Name's Sam Garrett. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust and looked Hannah up and down with a stare that could tan hide. I sure hope you can cook better than the last one. A dead silence fell over the yard. It felt like even the wind held its breath. Hannah could feel every single man's eyes on her. She felt Caleb stiffen beside her, getting ready to step in, ready to protect her honor. And right there in that moment, she made a decision that would set the course for every day that was to come. She took a step forward. She looked Sam Garrett right in his eyes, and she answered for herself. I can cook well enough to keep 9 men fed through a whole Montana winter, Mr. Garrett. But what is more important is that I can shoot, I can butcher, and I can sew up a wound. So if you do not like what is for supper, you are more than welcome to cook your own, or you can go hunt your own." The quiet in that room stretched for 3 long heartbeats. Then Sam Garrett did something that seemed to just stun every man in the room. He laughed. It was a real booming laugh, full of genuine surprise and the clear sound of respect. "Well, all right then," he said. "I reckon she will do just fine." The boy with the freckles was Thomas Young, 19 years old and as eager as a brand new puppy. He nearly fell over his own feet trying to help Hannah carry her trunk into the house. Sam mumbled something to Coop as they watched them go. "You keep an eye on that boy. He is a loyal one, but that kind of fire can burn out quick." The house was exactly what Caleb had told her it would be. 6 rooms, built solid. A big stone fireplace was the heart of the main room. The furniture was simple but made to last. There was a table with 8 chairs, and a couple of worn armchairs sat by the fire. The shelves were full of books and account ledgers. Everything was clean, but there were no comforts. It was a place for work, not for living. The kitchen was bigger than Hannah had figured on, with a good stove, lots of counter space, and shelves holding all the basic needs. She went to check the root cellar and felt the first real wave of peace wash over her since she had left Virginia. It was stocked proper. Barrels of potatoes with no soft spots to be found. Apples, each one wrapped in paper. Jars of preserved vegetables all in neat rows. Smoked hams and bacon hanging from the ceiling beams. After 3 years of trying to manage her father's empty pantry, of watching good food go bad before she could serve it, of stretching every meal until it was nearly transparent, this cellar felt like a holy place. Upstairs, she found 3 bedrooms and a little study. The biggest bedroom was clearly Caleb's, with his few things arranged like a soldier's barracks. The study had a desk, more ledgers, and maps of the land tacked up on the walls. And at the very end of the hall, there was a door that would not budge. Hannah jiggled the handle. It was locked up tight. She stood looking at it for a good long while. "Just storage," Caleb said from right behind her. She had not even heard him walk up the stairs. "Old things. Nothing in there you will be needing." His voice was plain and easy. But when Hannah glanced over his shoulder, she saw Coop standing at the bottom of the stairs, and the look on the foreman's face was not easy at all. It was worry, sharp as a blade and clear as day. Hannah decided to let it be, for the time being. That first night, the wind came howling at the house like it was a wild animal. She heard wolves call out somewhere deep in the darkness, and she shot straight up in bed before she could even think. Right beside her, Caleb snapped awake from a dead sleep. His hand dove under his pillow and came back holding a rifle, slick as a whistle. His eyes scanned the whole room, checking the windows, then the door, before his body seemed to realize the trouble was outside, not in. "Just wolves," he said, sliding the rifle back to its hiding place. "They don't ever get too close to the house." But Hannah saw how he did it. The pure speed of it. It was the easy, familiar motion of a man who had grabbed for a gun in the dark before and meant to use it. That was not how a man scared of wolves acted. That was how a man acted when he had been jumped in his own home. She tucked that little piece of information away. It went right next to the locked room, right next to the lie he told about Margaret. It sat with the memory of outlaws who knew his name and his sister's quiet whisper about a man named Crane. The proof was piling up, plain as day. She just needed a quiet moment to put it all together. Winter didn't just arrive in Montana, it laid siege to the place. The first blizzard came down hard in early December. For 3 whole days you could not see a thing, just a world of white. The barn, which was only 50 yards from the back porch, vanished completely behind a curtain of snow. Hannah learned a trick for surviving on the frontier. You stretch heavy rope from one building to the next, tying it to posts and door handles. That way you could feel your way through the blinding snow and not get lost. She tied all the knots herself. Good and tight, even. Coop watched her do it and gave her one sharp nod. She was learning that was about the highest praise you could get from that man. The cold was something else entirely. It was not like the cold back in Virginia, which had a bite to it, but you could deal with it. This cold here was final. The water in the bucket would freeze solid on the short walk from the well to the kitchen. Her own breath would turn to ice in the air and fall like tiny little diamonds. The thermometer hanging outside the kitchen window dropped so far down the mercury looked like it just gave up, huddled at the bottom of the glass like a spooked rabbit. Hannah learned how to build a fire that would burn all through the night. She figured out which drafts you could stuff with old rags and which ones were just part of the house now. She learned to cook for 9 hungry men with the kind of focus and timing of a general running a war. Breakfast was at 6 in the morning, sharp. Supper was at sundown. And everything had to be hot, with plenty of it, and right on time. The men, well, they tested her. You knew they would. Sam tested her by being quiet and looking skeptical, eating her food but never saying a word, just watching her with those sharp old eyes that never missed a thing. Thomas tested her with an eagerness that was almost like he worshipped her. He was always underfoot, always wanting to help, until Hannah finally had to tell him straight that she could haul her own water and he needed to go do the job he was paid for. The others tested her by keeping their distance, like men who had not had a woman around for 7 years and were not quite sure how to act. And then the wolves showed up. Not just the howling she heard way off on her first night. These were real wolves. They were at the chicken coop. It was 2 in the morning, and Caleb and most of the hands were way out in the far pasture checking on the cattle. Hannah woke up to the sound of chickens making a racket like the world was ending. She was out of that bed and down the stairs before her brain was even all the way awake. She grabbed the shotgun off the rack over the kitchen door, the one Caleb had showed her how to use on her first day. She ran right out into the cold in nothing but her nightgown and boots, and the air hit her like 1,000 tiny knives. The wolf was already inside the coop. It was a big fella, gray and skinny, with the kind of desperate hunger that winter brings. It had ripped its way through a weak spot in the wire fence, and was killing chickens with the cold, quick work of a predator who knew it did not have much time. Hannah brought the shotgun up to her shoulder. She steadied her breath, just like her grandfather had taught her all those years ago back in Virginia. And she fired one time. The wolf went down. She just stood there in the snow, her boots on her bare feet, her nightgown splattered with chicken blood, and the shotgun still held ready. She did not even know someone was watching until Sam Garrett spoke up from the darkness behind her. He had come back from the cattle check because he had forgotten his gloves. He had seen the whole thing, how fast she had moved, how steady her hands were. That single, clean shot. He did not say a word about it that night. But the next morning at breakfast he called her ma'am for the very first time. That word felt different coming from him now. It was like he had pulled it out of storage, dusted it off real good, and decided she had finally earned the right to it. Calving season hit in late February, and the whole ranch turned into a kind of organized storm. For 3 solid weeks, it felt like nobody got more than 4 hours of sleep at a time. The cows were having their babies in the nearby pastures, and everybody took turns on watch, just waiting and ready to jump in if a birth went wrong. Hannah worked right there with the men. She helped pull calves when the mothers were having a hard time. She doctored infections using the supplies Caleb kept in the barn. She even bottle-fed the little ones whose mothers would not take them, sitting up all night in the hay with a warm bottle and a baby calf that already weighed more than she did. The breeched calf was born on the worst night of all. It was midnight. The temperature was way below 0. A cow was in real trouble. Her calf was coming out backwards, and Hannah was the only person in the barn. She took off her coat. She rolled up her sleeves. She reached right inside that laboring animal with her bare hands, feeling around in the dark and the warmth for the calf's little legs. She worked by the light of a lantern covered in blood and fluid, with the sound of the cow screaming as it fought to bring a new life into the world. She found the legs. She got a good hold, and she pulled with every bit of strength she had. The calf slid out, alive, just barely, but it was breathing. Caleb showed up about 10 minutes later. He had run all the way from the far pasture after Coop sent for him. He found Hannah just sitting there in the straw, with blood dried all the way up to her elbows, and the little calf was nursing, weak but steady, at its mother's side. He did not say, "Good job." And he did not say, "You should have waited for me." He just sat down next to her in that bloody straw, took her hand, and very slowly, very carefully, he started wiping the blood off her arm with his own handkerchief. That was the first time he had ever laid a hand on her with any real kindness. The feed sack was coarse, but his touch was sure and gentle. After all the panic and exhaustion, that simple gesture spoke louder than any words ever could. He said in a low voice, "You have been through this before." She shook her head, not in a Montana barn at midnight with the frost so thick you could scrape it off the walls. "You moved fast," she told him. "You did not even pause." He looked right at her. "Neither did you. The second you walked in, you went straight for the mare, checking her breathing and holding her steady. We worked together like we had done it 100 times before." He held her eyes for a long moment. In that lantern-lit barn, with the heavy scent of hay, blood, and new life all around them, something changed. It was not love. Not then. But it was the first true sign that this arrangement was turning into something more than either of them had bargained for. A couple of days later, a skittish young cow kicked Thomas. Hannah set his broken fingers with a calm that was almost unnerving, making splints from firewood and bandages from a torn flour sack. From that day on, Sam took to calling her Doc, and the name just stuck. Spring felt a long way off when Ruth Dawson rode in from town. Everybody called her Ruthie. She ran the boarding house in the closest settlement, which was a good 2-hour ride from the ranch. She was a woman of 60, built stout as a pickle barrel, with eyes that could spot a fib from across the county, and a tongue that could slice right through you. She always brought supplies, the latest gossip, and an apple pie that had the ranch hands nearly coming to blows over the final piece. She was all warmth and smiles with Hannah, making her feel right at home. But she kept looking at Hannah in a peculiar way, as if she was measuring her against someone else. The moment Caleb went outside to see to a horse, Ruthie leaned in close to Hannah there in the kitchen, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You know, you put me in mind of her. Not your face. It is the way you hold yourself, like you are just waiting for the next bad thing to happen." Hannah's hands stopped their work on the dish she was washing. "Who are you talking about?" Ruthie's face changed in an instant. She knew she had let her tongue run away with her. "Just an old woman talking nonsense, dear. Pay me no mind." She quickly changed the topic to the best way to make a pie crust and how high the price of flour was getting. But the words were already out. It was one more piece of the puzzle, another small crack in the wall Caleb had built around his secret. That night, knowing Caleb was out checking the far fences and would not be back until well after dark, Hannah knew what she had to do. She found the key to that locked room inside Caleb's desk drawer, tucked away beneath the ranch account books. It was hidden, but not well enough to fool a woman who had spent her whole life learning where men tuck away their secrets. She went up the stairs. She slid the key into the lock. She turned it. The door swung open into a room that had been sealed for years. A thick blanket of dust covered every single surface. But underneath all that dust, the room was kept perfect, like a shrine. A woman's dresses were still hanging in the closet, the colors faded, but still holding the faintest hint of old perfume. On the dresser sat a hairbrush with strands of auburn hair tangled in its bristles, a hand mirror with a crack running through it, a wedding band, not the simple gold one Hannah wore, but an older, fancier one, with a little garnet stone. And there on the desk by the window was a letter, half written in a woman's elegant script. Hannah's hands were steady as she picked it up. For now, to the Territorial Marshal at Fort Benton. "I am writing to report the criminal actions of Mr. Silas Crane of the Crane Ranch, which include the poisoning of water sources on the Mercer land. I have personally witnessed on 3 separate occasions." The words just stopped right there. The page was stained with something dark and old. It could have been water, or it could have been blood. Hannah read the letter again. Then she glanced out the window, and from that high up she saw it for the very first time. A single small stone marker under the big oak tree behind the house. It had no name on it, just a date. March 14th, 1868. Margaret Mercer never left him. Margaret Mercer never went back to Philadelphia. Margaret Mercer was buried less than 30 yards from the bed where Hannah now slept, beneath an oak tree her husband planted when he first built their home, and the letter she was writing when her life ended, named the man responsible. Hannah put the letter down. Her hands were shaking now, not from the cold or from fear, but from the crushing weight of the truth. She had married a good man. She still wanted to believe that. But this good man had buried his first wife under a tree, locked away all her things, told everyone she ran off, and then brought a new wife into the very same house without ever breathing a word that the last one had died in it. And the man who was responsible lived just 10 miles down the road. She shut the door. She put the key back. She went back downstairs. She finished kneading the dough she had started that morning. The bread still had to be baked, and the livestock still had to be fed. The world kept on spinning, even when you find out you are living in a dead woman's house. But her hands, those strong, capable, steady hands, they trembled the entire time. Caleb knew his wife had been in the room just by the way she looked at him. It was not anger he saw. It was not fear. It was patience. The kind of patience a woman has when she is just waiting for the storm to hit, having already decided she is not going to run from the wreckage. She never said a word to him about it. That was worse. If she had yelled or cried or thrown that unfinished letter at his head, he could have met her anger with excuses, with reasons, with all the defenses he had spent 7 years building around that lie. But instead, she just pulled away. All the little moments of closeness they had started to build, the way her fingers would brush his when she handed him his coffee, the way she sat near him by the fire at night, the gentle look in her eyes he had started to see. It all just disappeared. In its place was a careful, polite distance that cut him deeper than any accusation ever could. Caleb had lived by himself for 7 years and thought he knew what lonely was. But he was learning that sleeping beside a woman who chose to be silent was a whole other kind of alone. He fell back on the only thing he knew. Control. He told Hannah she was not to ride off the ranch without someone with her. He told her it was because the bears were waking up for spring. The real reason was a gut-deep fear that she would ride into town, find Ruthie or someone else, and learn the whole truth from a stranger's lips instead of his own. Hannah followed his order for exactly 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, she looked at him over the breakfast table, and he saw something in her eyes he recognized. He had seen that same look in Margaret's eyes once, the day she told him she was going to write to the marshal, whether he liked it or not. "You married me for my strength," Hannah said. Her voice was even, but there was pure steel underneath it. "And now you are trying to put me in a cage because you are scared of what I might find." She let that hang in the air for a moment. "You are sounding more and more like my father every day, Caleb Mercer." Those words seared him like a hot branding iron. He actually recoiled. Without another word, he pushed his chair back, walked out to the barn, saddled his horse, and rode out toward the far pastures. He did not say another word to her for 2 full days. On the 2nd day, Hannah went to find Coop. She found him in the barn, mending a broken bridle. She placed the unfinished letter on the workbench right between them. She just stood there with her hands by her sides, not demanding, not begging, just firm. It was the way a woman stands when she has made up her mind not to leave until she gets what she came for. Margaret never left, did she? It was a statement, not a question. Coop stared at the letter for a long, long time. His hands, the same scarred and steady hands that had worked this ranch for 15 years, just stopped moving. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "She did not leave." And then he told her the whole story. It was 7 years back. Caleb had gone to Helena to buy some new stock, a trip that took 3 days. While he was away, 4 men rode onto the ranch. Margaret was in the house all by herself. The ranch hands were all out on the far side of the property, checking the fences. No one even heard the gunshots until it was far too late. She put up a fight. He put up a... Coop's voice was low and tight, but Hannah could still hear the old pain buried under it. There were signs she fought back. A busted window, a rifle that had been fired one time, but it was 4 against 1. They shot her right there in her own kitchen. She was still holding on when I got to her, just barely. I carried her to her bed and did what I could. I sent a man riding after Caleb. He made the return trip in half the time it should have taken, nearly killing his horse in the process. When he got back, Margaret was still breathing, that was all. He sat by her side for 3 days straight. He talked to her the whole time, even after she could not hear him anymore. After she was gone, he dug the grave with his own 2 hands. He would not let a single person help him. It took him 6 hours in that frozen ground. Hannah stood perfectly still, letting the story soak into her like rain into dry Texas earth, changing everything it touched. "And what happened after?" she asked. Coop's jaw clenched. "After he buried her, he rode straight for Crane's ranch. I tried my best to stop him. He threw me off his horse like I was a sack of feathers. By the time I managed to catch up to him, Crane was on the ground with his face smashed in, and Caleb was still hitting him. I had to knock Caleb out just to make him stop. Crane lived, but just barely. And that devil used it. He filed assault charges, and the territorial judge was already in his pocket. It cost Caleb 3 years of the ranch's profits to pay the damages and the lawyers. That is why things are so tight around here, even on good land. Caleb has been paying for that one time he lost his control." Hannah shut her eyes for a second, then she opened them. Why did he lie? About her leaving? Because if folks knew Margaret had been murdered, Caleb would have had to name Crane as the man responsible. And if he had named him, he would have gone to finish the job for good this time. And I would have had to watch them hang him. Everything he built, everything Margaret died trying to protect, it would have all been sold off to Crane at auction. Coop looked her straight in the eye. So Caleb put the truth in the ground right alongside his wife, and I was the one who helped him do it. He stopped for a moment. "But you are here now, Mrs. Mercer, and I reckon you deserve to know the kind of folks you are living with, and what kind of trouble you have landed in the middle of." That very same afternoon, a letter came all the way from Virginia. Hannah opened it up, thinking it would be news from Lydia about whatever new mess Gerald had gotten himself into. But what she found inside was a confession, and it felt like the ground just fell away from under her feet. Lydia's handwriting was all shaky, like her hand was trembling the whole time she was writing. "Dearest Hannah, I have been carrying this secret since before your wedding, and the weight of it is just breaking me. Before Mr. Mercer ever came to town, I found some letters in Father's study. He was writing back and forth with a man named Silas Crane. For months, Father had been selling him information about the Mercer Ranch. Land surveys, maps of the water sources, financial papers. Anything Crane was willing to pay for. Those payments were what was keeping Father in whiskey and paying off his worst debts. I should have told you. Before the wedding. Before you said yes to go out there. But I was scared. I was scared that if you knew the truth, you would not marry Mr. Mercer, and then we would both end up starving. So I did not say a word. I told myself I was doing it to protect you, but I was just protecting myself. I was a coward, Hannah. I am so sorry. I am so terribly, terribly sorry." Hannah read that letter 2 times. Her hands were perfectly still. Her face showed nothing at all. But on the inside, something deep down was starting to crumble. Her own father had traded her safety for a bottle of whiskey. Her sister, her dear sister, the only person in the world she thought was on her side, had known all about the danger and kept it a secret. She had let Hannah walk with a blindfold on, right into the sights of a man who had already killed 1 wife on this very ranch. It seemed like everyone in her life had sold off a piece of her just to save themselves. For 1 awful second, standing right there in the kitchen with Lydia's letter in one hand and Margaret's last words burned into her mind, Hannah had to wonder if Caleb was any different. Did he pick her because he saw something special in her? Or did he just need a living, breathing woman in a dead wife's house so he could win some legal fight? She did not cry, she did not scream. She folded both of those letters up, neat as you please, put them in the pocket of her apron, and went to go find her husband. He was in the barn, fixing a saddle. His hands moved with that easy memory that comes from a man who has done the same job 10,000 times. He looked up when she walked in, and she could see in his eyes that he already knew something had changed for good. Hannah laid Margaret's letter down on the workbench. Then she put Lydia's letter right next to it. "Your wife was murdered by Silas Crane," she said, her voice steady and clear. "My father sold your secrets to the man who killed her. My sister knew about it and did not tell me before we got married. And you brought me all the way out here without saying one single word about any of it." She stopped for a moment. "Is there more? Is there some other truth that I'm living with and do not even know it?" Caleb put his tools down. For the very first time since she had known the man, Hannah saw tears gather in those winter-pale eyes. They were not falling. They were just there, present. A fact you could not deny. Margaret did not just die, Hannah. Her death is on my hands. I left her by herself. I knew Crane was a dangerous man, and I still left her all alone to go buy cattle that could have waited another month. She died right there in our kitchen, writing a letter to try and save this very ranch, and I was not there to keep her safe. His voice got low. And after. I rode to Crane's ranch and I beat him until his face was not a face anymore. Coop had to knock me clean out just to make me quit. That is the man I am, Hannah. That is the thing that lives inside of me. A man who failed the woman he loved and then turned into the same kind of animal he swore his whole life he would never be. I kept it from you because I was ashamed. Not just that Margaret died, but of what I did after, of what I wanted to do, of what I still want to do every single time I see Crane's fence line from the high pasture. Hannah took all of this in. Every last bit. The sorrow and the rage and the shame and the lie that had built up around it all like a tough scar over a bad wound. Then she spoke and her voice was sharp, like the edge of broken glass. "You lied to protect yourself, not me." "Yes. And my sister stayed quiet to protect herself, not me." Caleb was silent for a spell. "I cannot speak for what your sister did. You do not have to. I'm starting to see the way things are." Hannah's eyes burned, but no tears came. "Everybody in my life gets to decide what I can take. Everybody decides how much truth I am allowed to have. And I am through with it, Caleb. I am through with being protected right into foolishness. What is it you want from me? Everything. Every last secret, every ugly truth, every fear you have been carrying all by yourself. I did not come 2,000 miles just to live in another house built on lies." The silence that stretched between them was a massive thing. It was bigger than the whole Montana sky outside the barn doors, bigger than 7 years of grief and blame, bigger than the space between two people who had picked each other for practical reasons and were now standing at the edge of something a whole lot more risky. Then Caleb Mercer did the hardest thing he had ever done since he dug his first wife's grave out of the frozen ground. He told Hannah all of it. That night she slept in one of the spare rooms, not to punish him, but because she had to. She needed the room to think, to feel her own grief, to figure out if the partnership she was promised was a real thing or just another kind of business deal her father had arranged. And in the main bedroom, Caleb Mercer laid wide awake in a bed that felt bigger than all of Montana, just staring up at the ceiling. He was understanding for the first time that keeping Hannah safe and keeping Hannah near him might be two entirely different jobs, and that he might have to make a choice. Silas Crane rode up to the Mercer Ranch on a Sunday morning. He came with a smile on his face, the way a rattlesnake comes out to sun itself on a warm rock. Nothing about him looked dangerous at all. That is exactly what made him so terrifying. Hannah spotted him from the kitchen window. He was a man in his 50s, sitting on a fine horse and dressed way better than any working rancher ever should be. His boots were polished, his coat was clean. He wore a hat that looked like it had never seen a lick of bad weather. He rode with the comfortable posture of a man who gave more orders than he took, and he held a bottle of good whiskey in one hand like a visiting card. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked out onto the porch right as Caleb came around from the side of the house, his hand already sitting easy on the revolver at his hip. The change in Caleb was instant and complete. Every muscle in his body pulled tight. His face turned to something that looked like it was carved out of granite. And his eyes, those eyes like a winter sky, they went flat and empty in a way Hannah had never seen before. Crane. The name came out of Caleb like the sound of a pistol hammer being pulled back. Mercer. Crane's smile was wide and warm and did not mean a thing. Just thought I would be neighborly. I heard you went and got yourself a bride. Figured I would ride over and offer my good wishes. He swung down from his horse with a smooth grace, walked up the porch steps, and aimed that warm, empty smile right at Hannah. Mrs. Mercer, it is a real pleasure. Old Caleb here has been needing a woman's touch around this place. The last one did not seem to take to this frontier life as I recall it. Hannah felt Caleb stiffen up right next to her. She could feel the violence rolling off of him like heat from a wood stove, coming in waves barely held back, straining against whatever leash he had on it. And right then, Hannah made a choice that would change the direction of everything that came next. She made herself disappear. Not like she used to disappear in her father's house because she was ashamed or just trying to get by. This time, she chose it. On purpose. As a plan. She dropped her gaze, let her body go soft, and folded her hands in front of her apron just like Lydia used to do. She became the exact kind of woman that a man like Silas Crane would look right past without a second thought. Small. Quiet. Something pretty to look at, maybe. But mostly just invisible. "Thank you for stopping by, Mr. Crane," she said in a voice that was a few notches softer than her real one. "Can I get you some tea?" Crane looked at her the way a fellow looks at the pattern on the wallpaper. He saw it and then he forgot it. "That would be mighty fine, Mrs. Mercer, very kind of you." He turned his attention back to Caleb, and Hannah slipped back into the kitchen to put the water on to boil and listen to every single word through the open window. Crane's sales pitch was as smooth as could be. He wanted to buy up the water rights that cut through Mercer's land. A generous offer, he called it. Fair to both of them. They were neighbors, he said. They should be working together. Caleb's answer was barely held in check. "The last time we worked together, I lost more than just water. The temperature on that porch must have dropped 20 degrees. Crane's smile never wavered. He finished his tea. He said his goodbyes. And he rode off with the easy confidence of a man who was sure that time was on his side. The very moment Crane's horse was out of the gate, Hannah dropped that quiet little act like a snake shedding its skin. "He is the one who killed Margaret," she said, stepping back out onto the porch. "He was the one who sent those men on the road. And now he is sitting on our porch drinking our tea and asking to buy our water. What are we going to do about it?" Caleb turned and looked at her. Something in his face changed. She had said we, not you. We. For the first time since the truth had come out, since the story of the locked room and the letters, and since the 2 nights she had stayed in the spare bedroom, Hannah Mercer was not standing apart from her husband. She was standing right there with him. He told her everything there was to know about Crane. The whole history. They used to be business partners. They had a falling out over those same water rights. The raid. Margaret's letter. The beating. The lawsuit. The crooked county sheriff who had been in Crane's pocket for 15 years. "You do not have any real proof," Hannah said after he had laid it all out. "Nothing that a judge would accept, no. Margaret's letter is not finished. It makes the accusation, but it does not prove it. It is a place to start." Hannah's mind was already turning, shifting all the pieces around the way she used to turn the soil in her father's worn-out fields, looking for something that she could make grow. My father was selling information to Crane. That has to mean there is a paper trail somewhere. Letters. Records of payment. Papers that link Crane to my father and my father to the secrets of your ranch. If we can find that trail, then we can show a pattern. A pattern, plus Margaret's letter, plus folks who are still alive and can talk, might just be enough. Caleb just stared at her. You have been thinking on this? I have been thinking on this since the day I found that room. That was the moment their partnership turned into something real, not because of a wedding, not because they worked together in the barn. It was because they were building a plan together against an enemy they both shared. Two minds looking at the same problem from two different ways, and realizing that together they could see things that neither one of them could see alone. That week, Hannah found out something else. She was in the kitchen after dark, cleaning up the supper dishes, when she heard the bunkhouse door make a little squeak. She looked out the window and saw Thomas Young slipping out into the night, moving with that quiet care of somebody who did not want anyone to see him. Hannah knew that kind of walk. She had gotten it down perfect herself, moving through her father's house in the dead of night, knowing which floorboards to skip, turning herself into a ghost whenever she needed to find out what Gerald was hiding. She followed Thomas, very careful, very quiet, using the skills she had learned over 22 years of figuring out dangerous men and how to move around them without getting caught. Thomas walked all the way to the northern edge of the property. In the shadow of the old fence, a man on a horse was waiting. They spoke in low voices. Some papers were passed from one to the other. Then the rider turned and left, and Thomas walked back toward the bunkhouse, his shoulders slumped over with that heavy weight of a guilty conscience. Hannah stepped right out of the shadows. Thomas nearly jumped clear out of his skin. She did not raise her voice. She did not make any threats. She just looked at him with that steady, knowing look of a woman who had lived her whole life around men making bad choices. How long? She asked him. Thomas's face just seemed to fall apart. 3 months. It started before you even got here. Crane knows about my gambling debts. He says he will tell my pa back home in Nebraska if I do not do what he says. My pa would disown me, Mrs. Mercer. He is all I have got in this world. Hannah looked at that terrified boy and saw herself clear as day. She saw someone caught in a trap, held there by what other folks had on them. Someone doing the wrong thing for reasons you could almost understand. She told him, "Here is how this is going to go. You will keep on meeting Crane's man. But from this point forward, you are going to give him the information I tell you to. You will feed him bad numbers, wrong schedules, anything that will lead him astray. You will be working for us now." Thomas just stared at her, his eyes wide. "You are not going to tell the boss?" And that right there was Hannah's big mistake. The kind of blunder that would cost her dearly. The one that proved she was just as human and flawed as Caleb and Lydia, who she had judged so harshly. "Not yet," she said. "I will take care of this." She told herself it was because she had to act fast. She believed she could manage it all on her own. She did not want to drop another crisis on Caleb's shoulders while he was still sore from his own secrets coming to light, but the real reason was simpler and a whole lot uglier. She just did not trust anyone enough to share the reins. She had been carrying the whole load for so long that the thought of setting it down, of letting someone else help with the weight, did not feel like relief. It felt like giving up. She was doing the very things she had condemned Caleb for, making a decision all on her own to protect someone, without them even knowing about it. And she could not see the irony. Not then. In the weeks that followed, something delicate and uncertain started to grow back between Hannah and Caleb. They started eating supper together again. They talked by the fire in the evenings. He showed her the ranch books, every last one, even the pages that showed how the lawsuit had bled him dry for years. She shared her plans for the house, her ideas for the garden when spring came, and her thoughts on managing their supplies. One night, she spoke softly. "I am sorry I said you were like my father. That was the meanest thing I could have possibly said, and it was not fair." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He said, "It was not entirely unfair either. I was trying to control you. I called it protection, but protection that comes with a locked gate is just another word for owning something." He took a breath. "My father raised cattle his whole life, and he always said the same thing. A penned animal is not safe. It is just trapped. I was penning you, Hannah, and I am sorry for it." She moved and sat down next to him, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth. I need you to promise me something, she said. Just name it. No more decisions about my safety unless I say so. I am your partner, not your property. Agreed. He looked right at her. And that goes for you, too. Those words landed on Hannah like a rock in a calm pond. She felt the ripples spread right through her, touching the secret she was keeping about Thomas, about the false stories she was feeding to Crane, about the plan she was cooking up all by herself in the dark. She should have told him right then and there. She knew it, the way you can feel a storm coming by the heavy feel of the air. But she pushed that feeling down deep. She told herself she would tell him soon, just not right now. She just needed a little more time. She laid awake that night listening to the sound of Caleb's breathing. It was even and deep. He had not had a nightmare for the first time in weeks. She had asked him to stop keeping secrets from her. He had agreed. He had asked her for the same promise. She had agreed. And hidden inside her recipe box, tucked between instructions for sourdough bread and canning tomatoes, was a list of lies she was passing to Silas Crane through a scared 19-year-old boy. It was a secret she was keeping from her husband for the very same reason he had kept his secrets from her, because she was sure she knew better. The irony of it all tasted like copper in her mouth, like blood from a busted lip, like every lie she had ever been told by people who swore they loved her. The fire started on the East Ridge at 3 in the morning. Caleb was already out of bed before the orange glow even fully registered in his mind. He knew this was not a lightning strike. There had not been a storm. He knew this was not some campfire that got out of hand. Nobody camped that close to his property line. This was Silas Crane, signing his name across the sky with smoke and fire. He threw on his boots and was out the door before Hannah had even finished getting dressed. She could hear him in the yard shouting orders, his voice cutting through the blackness like a sharp knife. The voice of a man who had spent his whole life getting ready for a crisis. By the time she got to the porch, the whole eastern horizon was a solid wall of orange and red. The wind, that relentless Montana wind that never quits and never rests, was driving that fire straight for the cattle pens in the east barn. Every hand on the ranch was already moving. Coop had the men organized before Caleb even finished barking out his orders. Sam and 2 other hands ran for the well to start hauling water. Miguel and his brother Carlos jumped on their horses to push the cattle west, away from the coming flames. Thomas, with his ankle mostly healed up from that heifer kick a few weeks back, was scraping out a fire break with a shovel in each hand and pure terror written all over his face. Hannah saddled Liberty, the mare she had come to call her own, and rode straight for the cattle before anyone had a chance to tell her no. The smoke hit her like a solid punch to the gut. It was black and thick, and it choked the air right out of her lungs. Then came the heat, a blistering wave that felt like an oven door swinging open, even from 200 yards away. She found the herd in total chaos. 200 head of cattle, wild with fear, their eyes rolling white in their heads, stampeding in every direction. Miguel and Carlos were trying their best to turn them west, but the fire was moving too fast, pushing the herd down toward the creek bed where they would surely pile up and crush each other to death. Hannah rode right into the middle of that mess. She hollered and whistled and swung her rope, turning one animal at a time, then 2, then a whole group. Like a single rock placed just right can change the course of a whole river. Liberty ran like she was born to do it, cutting and weaving through the panicked herd with an instinct you just cannot teach. They lost 30 head. 30 animals that did not turn in time, that ran straight into the fire instead of away from it, that died screaming in a way Hannah knew she would hear in her sleep for months to come. But they saved the rest of them. She was riding the edge of the fire, checking for any strays, when she saw Thomas through a break in the smoke. He was on foot. His horse had bucked him off when a burning tree branch fell right in front of them. He was limping hard on his bad ankle, stumbling through the smoke. And the fire was coming up right behind him like a hungry beast, a wall of heat and flame eating up the grass faster than any man could run. Hannah did not even think about it. She wheeled Liberty around and rode straight back toward the flames. The heat hit her like a furnace blast. Hot embers landed on her arms and burned clean through her sleeves. Liberty screamed in protest but did not slow down because Hannah's hands on the reins were steady and sure, and that mare trusted her rider more than she feared the fire. Hannah reached Thomas, grabbed his arm, and hauled him up onto the saddle behind her with a strength she never knew she had. She kicked Liberty into a dead run. They cleared the line of fire with only seconds to spare. Behind them, the patch of ground where Thomas had just been standing burst into flames. They rode into the yard, both of them coughing and burned, but alive. Thomas slid off the horse and just laid there in the dirt, gasping for air. Hannah swung a leg over, her own legs shaking, her face black with soot, her eyebrows singed off, and her hands blistered raw. Caleb was standing by the well. He had seen the whole thing, the ride into the smoke, the rescue, the wild gallop out of the fire with a man thrown across her saddle and hell itself right on their heels. The look on his face was something Hannah knew she would carry with her for the rest of her days. It was not just fear, though fear was in it. It was not just pride, though that was in it too. It was the look of a man seeing something he had been scared to believe in come true right before his very eyes. Undeniable and real. By sunrise, the fire was dying down. Then the rain came, not the gentle spring shower Hannah had been wishing for, but a hard, angry Montana downpour that turned all the burned ground into a black, muddy mess of ash and water. Sam found the proof where the fire had started. Rags soaked in oil. 3 of them laid out in a line along the eastern fence where the grass was bone dry. It was the work of a professional. It was deliberate. Nobody bothered saying Crane's name. They did not have to. Caleb just stood there in the rain, looking at the wreckage of the east barn, the blackened acres of land and the bodies of 30 dead cattle. His hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides. The muscles in his neck were wound tighter than new barbed wire. Hannah knew exactly what he was thinking. She could read it in the hard set of his shoulders. He was fixing to saddle his horse and ride over to Crane's ranch, and this time Coop would not be able to stop him. She stepped right in front of him, put herself square between Caleb and that horse. If you go over there tonight, you will kill him. Then you will hang for it. And Crane will have won. He will be dead, but he will have won. Margaret will have died all over again. Is that what you want? Caleb looked at her, and his eyes were not winter pale anymore. They were burning like a furnace, blazing with 7 long years of fury he had kept locked away. Then what? What do you want me to do, Hannah? Just sit here and let him burn down everything I have ever built? I want you to trust me. I have a plan. What plan? And right there, it all fell to pieces. In the heat of the moment, trying so hard to stop Caleb from doing something that would ruin him forever, Hannah told him everything. She told him about Thomas. She told him about the double agent game she had been playing for weeks. She told him about the bad information she had been feeding to Crane's man. She told him about the whole strategy she had built, all by herself, in secret, without saying a single word to the man she had promised to be a partner to. The silence that came after her words was worse than the roar of the fire. Caleb became completely still. The rage did not go away. It just turned. You have been handling this all by your lonesome. Sneaking around behind my back. You were feeding information to Crane through Thomas and never said a word to me. When were you going to tell me after your little plan worked out? That way you could show it off as some big victory instead of the gamble you took with my ranch, my people, and our very lives. Caleb, you did the one thing you made me promise I would never do again. You decided for me what I could take. You made choices about my own safety without asking me. You looked me right in the eye and demanded honesty. Then you turned around and lied to me by keeping silent every single day. Hannah had no answer for him. Because he was right. Every last word. She had done exactly what she had called him out for. And the worst part was not his anger, but her own understanding of why he did it. It was because trusting someone else with that kind of burden was a whole lot harder than carrying it all by yourself. It was because she had been the one holding things together for 22 long years, and letting go of that control did not feel like freedom. It felt like falling off a cliff. You are right, she said, her voice low. I am so sorry. I was wrong. Sorry does not take back the risk you put us in. No, it sure does not. But I am telling you now, everything, and I am asking you to work with me on this instead of pushing me away. Can you do that for me?" The silence hung heavy in the air. The rain kept falling. The smoldering barn hissed and steamed somewhere in the dark. "Tell me the plan," Caleb finally said. "The whole thing, and then we will make a decision together. That is what being partners is all about, Hannah. Together. It is not about you trying to carry the whole world on your shoulders and calling that strength." Hannah Mercer had spent her whole life being strong on her own. In that moment, she learned a lesson that was tougher than any winter she had ever lived through, harder than any fire she had ever faced. She learned that the opposite of being weak was not being independent. It was having trust. She told him everything. They made their plan together, standing there in the rain next to the burned-out ruins of the East Barn. They drew pictures in the mud with sticks, arguing and changing things until they had something that just might work. They would use Thomas to feed Crane one last piece of bait. The story was that Caleb was financially ruined by the fire. He was desperate, ready to sell off the water rights for just a little bit of what they were worth. A man like Crane would not be able to turn that down. They would invite Crane to the ranch to sign the papers. They would set the scene with witnesses who had a good reason to be there. Sarah and Jack Morrison would come for a social call. The minister would be making his usual rounds. Ruthie would bring some supplies out from town. It would all look perfectly normal. There would be nothing to make a cautious man nervous. Then they would let Hannah do what she did best. Be the one nobody sees. Be the one they underestimate. She would be the woman no one was paying attention to while she dismantled the most dangerous man in the territory. And she would do it with nothing but the truth, some patience, and a pair of capable hands that folks had overlooked her entire life. Caleb hated the plan. It was not because it was a bad idea. He hated it because it put Hannah in the same room with the man who had murdered his first wife. Margaret was all alone when they came for her, Hannah said. "I will not be. You will be right there. Coop will be there. Sam will be there. Everyone. But Crane needs to see a woman who looks weak. And I have spent my whole life being underestimated by men like him. Let me use that against him." 2 days after the fire, a wagon rolled in from town carrying the last person on God's green earth Hannah expected to see. Lydia Whitmore climbed down from the wagon. She was thinner than Hannah remembered, worn out from the road and chapped by the wind. She was wearing a dress that would have sent her into a fit 3 months ago. She looked at her sister across the muddy yard, and Hannah saw something new in her face. It was not the shiny confidence Lydia used to wear like armor back in Virginia. This was something more raw, something real. "Father is dead," Lydia said. "He had a stroke 2 weeks ago. Uncle William in Richmond tried to marry me off to a banker twice my age, so I ran." She stopped to take a breath. "I do not have anywhere else to go, and I needed to tell you something in person, not in some letter. It is about Father and Crane. It is about what I knew and when I knew it." The two sisters just looked at each other, with all their secrets and silence and 1,000 miles of rough road between them. "I know what you did," Hannah said. "I received your letter. Then, you know I am sorry. I know you are sorry. I just do not know yet if I can forgive you." Her words were not warm. They were not cold. They were just honest. And for two women who grew up in a house full of lies, honest was a fine place to start. Hannah put on her blue wedding dress. It was the only fancy thing she had to her name. She slipped the 2-shot Derringer into her apron pocket. The little gun felt a whole lot heavier than it looked. Ruthie had brought it on her last visit. She had pressed it into Hannah's hands with tears shining in her sharp old eyes. "This was Margaret's," Ruthie had said. "She bought it the very week she got to Montana. She said she would never have to fire it. She was wrong about a few things, but she was right to buy this gun." Hannah checked the gun. Both chambers were loaded. She was ready. Today she would play the part of the meek, obedient wife one last time. And if everything went the way it was supposed to, today was the day the girl nobody ever wanted would finally bring down the man everyone was afraid of. The morning was pure chaos, just dressed up to look like a normal day. Thomas had dropped the bait 3 days earlier. The story he told was simple and easy to believe. Caleb Mercer was broke after the fire. He was desperate. He was ready to sell his water rights for half of what they were worth just to keep the ranch from going under. Crane had swallowed that bait like a hungry fish on a line. He bit down fast and hard and full of confidence. By 9 o'clock in the morning, every person was in place. Sarah and Jack Morrison showed up for what looked like a friendly social call. Sarah brought fresh bread and jars of preserves. Jack shook Caleb's hand, and the two of them talked about fixing fences and where to graze the cattle in the spring, just like two men who did not have a bigger worry in the world. The minister stopped by for what he called his regular pastoral rounds. He sat down in the parlor with a cup of coffee and the special kind of patience you see in a man of God who has been asked to witness something important. Ruthie brought supplies from town. Her wagon was loaded down with flour and sugar and all the everyday things that made her being there seem perfectly natural. Coop had the ranch hands positioned all around the property. You could not see them from the house, it was not obvious. But they were there, armed and ready, hiding in the barn and behind the woodpile and down along the fence line. They could be on that porch in 30 seconds if they were needed. Lydia's part in all this was something Hannah had not planned on until her sister showed up. But now, looking at Lydia in a borrowed dress with a determined look in her eyes, Hannah understood something. The skills their father had drilled into her older sister were not the weakness she had always thought they were. They were weapons. Just a different kind of weapon. Crane has never laid eyes on you, Hannah told Lydia. You are going to be the charming, empty-headed sister-in-law visiting from Virginia. You are going to make him feel comfortable. You will make small talk. You will read the room. And if things start to go sideways, you're going to get the other women out of that room. Lydia stood up a little straighter. A fierce look came over her face. You want me to use the skills Father raised me to have. The charm. The trick of making a man feel important while never showing him anything real. Yes, that is exactly it. Then I am finally good for something that actually matters. Hannah looked right at her sister. You were always good for something that mattered, Lydia. The world was just asking you the wrong questions. Right before Crane got there, Caleb found Hannah by herself in the kitchen. He checked his revolver. His hands were steady as a rock, but his eyes were dark with all the things he could not bring himself to say. If he puts a hand on you, Caleb started, he will not get the chance. But if he does, I have my own way of handling things. She showed him the Derringer. Where did you get that? Ruthie. It belonged to Margaret. Caleb froze. He stared at the small gun in his wife's hand, and Hannah watched 7 years of grief wash over his face like a storm rolling across the plains. Margaret bought that the first week we got to Montana, he said softly. She said she would never have to fire it. She was wrong about so many things, but she was right to buy that gun. He put his hands on both sides of Hannah's face. Those scarred hands had built so much and broken so much and had finally, at long last, learned how to be gentle. You come back to me, he said, no matter what happens in that room. You come on back to me. I am not going anywhere, Caleb. That is the whole point of all this. Silas Crane showed up at high noon. He brought his lawyer with him, a skinny, nervous fellow named Howell who handled what Crane liked to call his legal arrangements. Crane was dressed like he was on his way to a fancy ball at the governor's mansion. He had on polished boots, a fine coat, and a hat that probably cost more than Thomas made in a whole month. He saw Lydia first and turned on the charm, just like a man who had been flipping that switch on and off his entire life. Lydia sparkled right back at him with just the right mix of warmth and foolishness. She complimented his horse, asked about his ranch, and played the part she had been trained for since she was a little girl. She was brilliant. Crane dismissed her as nothing more than a pretty decoration in about 30 seconds. It was exactly what they had planned. Hannah served the tea. She kept her eyes looking down, she kept her voice soft, and she made her movements small and humble. She was the meek, overwhelmed wife out on the frontier. She was the kind of woman a man like Silas Crane had built his whole world on looking right through. They all sat down to do business. Crane spread the contract out on the table with the smug satisfaction of a man who was sure he had already won. Caleb played his part perfectly. He was the reluctant seller, beaten down by bad luck, gritting his teeth while he pretended to look over the words he already knew by heart. Hannah tipped the teapot a little more. Then, as if her hand slipped, she clumsily sloshed hot tea right across the contract. "Oh, my goodness, I am so sorry," she said, dabbing at the soaked paper like she was in a panic. "How clumsy of me. Let me just—" She kept mopping up the tea with a cloth. And while she was busy with that, her eyes scanned every last word of that fine print. What she saw was just what she'd figured she would. Tucked away in all the proper talk about water rights were a few lines giving Crane free rein to cross any part of the Mercer land. Not just for water, the land itself. It was a right-of-way that would let Crane's men come and go as they pleased, day or night, for any reason they cooked up. The very kind of access they would have needed 7 years ago to sneak up to the ranch house without anyone seeing. Hannah slowly straightened up. She put the damp cloth aside. And when she looked at Silas Crane, that quiet little wife was plumb gone. In her place was the woman who had pulled calves into the world at midnight, shot wolves in the pitch dark, and ridden straight through a wildfire to save a man's life. "Mr. Crane," she said, her voice ringing as clear and true as a bell, "this contract gives you unrestricted access across all of the Mercer property. That is not an agreement for water rights. That is an invitation to occupy our land." Crane's smile faltered for a second. "Mrs. Mercer, the legal particulars are probably best left to who? Your lawyer? The same one who drew up a mighty similar document for my father's land back in Virginia 3 years ago? The one that gave you unchecked access to his property that just so happened to border the Mercer Ranch's northern water supply?" The room went dead quiet. Crane's lawyer turned the color of soured milk. The polite mask on Crane's face started to crack. Just a hair. But Hannah saw it plain as day. "I do not know what you are suggesting," he said. "I am not suggesting a thing, Mr. Crane. I am telling you facts. You bought access to my father's property. You used that access to map out the Mercer water sources. Then you used that knowledge to poison the water upstream. Margaret Mercer wrote down 3 different times it happened before she was killed. She laid Margaret's last unfinished letter right there on the table." Crane just stared at it. His face changed completely. The fancy polish burned away like cheap paint in a blaze, showing the raw, ugly wood underneath. "That letter does not prove a thing," he snapped. "It is just the crazy talk of a hysterical woman who—" Caleb's chair scraped hard against the floor. His hand drifted down toward his hip. Over by the door, Coop shifted his weight, getting ready. Lydia spoke up before Crane could get his wits back. Her voice was cheerful, like she was just making conversation, but it was absolutely lethal. "Oh, Mr. Crane, I almost forgot. I brought along some of Father's letters from Virginia. He was such a pack rat, you know. Kept every single piece of mail he ever got. Including, I do believe, quite a few from you." She pulled a stack of letters, all tied up with a ribbon, from her satchel and set them on the table next to Margaret's. "With records of all the payments." Crane's composure shattered like a rock hitting a mirror. "I paid your father for honest land surveys," he said, his voice getting louder, losing that smooth, careful control. "You paid my father for information on a neighbor's ranch operations," Hannah said flatly. "The same neighbor whose wife was murdered not long after she figured out your dirty business. The same neighbor whose barn was set on fire last week with oil-soaked rags. The same kind of rags your lawyer's office buys by the barrel for their lamps, according to the ledger down at the general store, which I looked at myself." Crane shot up so fast, his chair clattered to the floorboards behind him. 7 years of waiting, 7 years of careful moves and clever excuses, and the slow, calculated ruin of the man who stood between him and the water he felt belonged to him. All of it went up in smoke in one hot flash of fury. "I have waited 7 years for this land," he yelled. 7 years of watching Mercer sit on water that ought to be mine, water I have got more claim to than some dirt-poor squatter who—" He stopped himself. His mouth snapped shut. But it was far too late. The words were already out there, and the room was full of folks who had heard every last one of them. The preacher, Sarah and Jack Morrison, Ruthie Dawson, who was crying without a sound, tears tracing paths down her weathered face, mourning for Margaret, her friend who was finally getting justice after 7 years in a grave with no name. Something just broke behind Crane's eyes. The scheming look came back cold and quick, but now it was twisted with desperation. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a knife. It was not a working man's tool, but a weapon, long and sharp, and held like he knew exactly how to use it. He lunged right at Hannah. Caleb moved faster than a blink. He threw himself between the blade and his wife, the one thing he had not been able to do 7 years ago, the failure he had punished himself for every single day since. The knife sliced his forearm. A long, shallow gash opened up like a red mouth, bleeding all over the table, onto Margaret's letter, and across the contract that was meant to steal everything Caleb had ever built. Sam and Coop hit Crane from both sides at once. They slammed him to the floor with the kind of practiced force of men who had been waiting for this very chance. Coop's knee dug into Crane's back. Sam wrenched the knife from his grip with one hand while pinning his wrist down with the other. The lawyer made a break for the door. Jack Morrison grabbed him out on the porch, one big rancher's hand clamped on the smaller man's collar. From the floor, with his face pressed into the wood of the house he had tried to destroy, Silas Crane screamed the words that sealed his own fate. "I should have finished the job 7 years ago. I should have killed Mercer too instead of just his woman." A full confession, in front of 5 witnesses, a preacher, 2 well-respected ranchers, the woman who had been Margaret Mercer's only true friend in all of Montana, and the wife who had orchestrated the whole thing while everyone was watching but nobody was seeing a thing. Jack Morrison took off riding for the county sheriff. At the same time, Sarah Morrison sent another rider to the territorial marshal over in Helena because Crane had too many friends in local law to trust the county man. Crane was locked down in the root cellar with an armed guard, cussing and spitting threats and promising to get even, though everyone in that room knew he would never get the chance. Hannah wrapped a bandage around Caleb's arm right there at the kitchen table. Her hands were shaking. For the very first time in this whole long story, from the first slap in her father's house to the fire line to this very moment, her hands actually trembled. It was not from fear. It was from the slow dawning truth that the knife had been coming for her heart, and Caleb had put himself in its way without a second thought. The same way she finally understood, he had failed to do for Margaret, the same choice. But he made it right this time, not because he was a different man, but because life gave him a second chance, and he took it. "Your plan nearly got me killed," Caleb said. "Your plan just saved your ranch," Hannah answered. He looked at her then. Blood was already soaking through the fresh bandage. His eyes were full of something that was not pain. "Our ranch," he said. She tied the knot on the bandage. She looked up and met his gaze, and for the first time in more months than they could count, they both smiled. It was not a big, easy smile, and it was not without its shadows, but it was real, and it was earned. The way anything worth a damn out on the frontier was earned. Through hard work and taking chances and being willing to stand your ground when the fire comes for you. That evening, with Crane locked away, the ranch hands standing guard, and Lydia in the kitchen making coffee like she had lived there her entire life, Hannah Mercer sat on her front porch and just listened to Montana. It was not the silence she had been so afraid of when she first came. It was the sound of the wind in the tall grass, the cattle settling down for the night, and the comfortable creak of a house that was still standing, still theirs. Margaret Mercer had started this fight 7 years ago, all alone in her kitchen with just a letter and a little 2-shot pistol. Hannah Mercer had just finished it, but not alone. She would never be alone again. Springtime came to Montana like a long overdue promise finally kept. The spring came on slow and stubborn. It was all the more beautiful because they had earned every bit of it. The snow line crawled back up the mountains. Green grass pushed its way back, even on the scorched acres to the east. Those little shoots coming through the black dirt were proof that just because something is destroyed, it does not mean it is over. Silas Crane was finally put on trial, but not in some local courthouse where his pet sheriff ran the show. He went before the territorial court in Helena, where the judges answered to a higher power and could not be bought with fine whiskey or old favors. The evidence against him was rock solid. They had Margaret's letter. They had all of Gerald Whitmore's messages, which proved he had been a paid spy for months. They had the proof from the arson. And they had 5 good people who testified they heard Crane confess with his own mouth. The cut on Caleb's arm, still pink and healing, was its own kind of testimony. The jury was out for less than 4 hours before they came back, guilty on every single charge, for planning the murder of Margaret Ann Mercer, for burning down Mercer Ranch property, for assault with a deadly weapon. The sentence was 25 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge. It was a place with stone walls and brutal winters, a place where no amount of money could buy you an early ticket out. The day the verdict came across the telegraph, Caleb just saddled his horse and rode to the high pasture all by himself. Hannah gave him his space until sunset, then she found him there. He was sitting on a big rock, just looking out over the land that seemed to stretch on forever. She tied her horse Liberty to a pine and sat down near him. She was close enough that he could reach for her, but she let him make the first move. After a good long while, he finally spoke. "It does not bring her back," he said. "No," she answered softly. "It does not. But it means she did not die for nothing." He reached over and took her hand. They sat there together and watched the sun dip behind the mountains, setting the whole sky ablaze with orange and gold. Then that deep bruised purple that comes right before the dark sets in. In the weeks after, the ranch found a new kind of peace. It was not the tense, haunted silence they had lived with before. This was a steady rhythm, one that had room for sorrow and for healing, and for the slow, hard work of building something that was meant to last. Gerald Whitmore was dead. Lydia had brought the news, and a letter from the lawyer handling his affairs confirmed it later. He had passed in his sleep from a stroke. It was quick and likely painless, which was a whole lot more kindness than he had ever shown his daughters after their mother died. Hannah did grieve. Not for the man who had hit her and used her and traded her security for whiskey money. She grieved for the man he was long before all that. The father who taught her how to read because he did not have a son and felt his girls should know their letters. The man who used to carry her on his shoulders through the fields back in Virginia and tell her she could be anything she wanted to be. That man had been gone for years before his body finally gave out. "Maybe that is what grieving really is," Lydia said one evening as the 2 sisters sat on the porch. "You are just mourning the distance between what was and what could have been." Lydia ended up staying all the way through spring. The sisters started to mend their relationship piece by piece. They were not trying to go back to how things were, which was a life built on secrets and rules no one ever talked about. They were building something brand new, something built on telling the truth even when it was hard. Lydia used her natural charm to help Hannah find her footing with the other ranchers in the area. She even got everyone to pitch in and help the families who lost things in the fire. She wrote letters to the territorial government about protecting their water rights, writing with a kind of graceful power that was second nature to her, but that Hannah could never quite manage. Then, one evening in late May, as they sat by the fire sipping tea, Lydia told Hannah her plan. "I am going to move to Helena," she said. "There is a woman there who runs a school for young ladies. She needs a teacher for etiquette and proper letter writing. She told me my skills are valuable." "They are valuable," Hannah said. And she meant it. They always were. Lydia offered a smile that was small and real, with none of the pretending she used to wear like a suit of armor back in Virginia. "I used to think you were the strong one, and I was just the one for decoration. But you taught me something, Hannah. We are both strong. We were just fighting different battles." The sisters hugged each other. It was real forgiveness. Not the easy kind where you just pretend that bad things never happened. It was the hard kind, the kind where you look straight at what happened and decide to love each other anyway. Thomas Young was still working at the ranch. His broken ankle had mended just fine. His gambling debts were all paid off too. Caleb had covered them, calling it an advance on the next 5 years of his wages. That was just Caleb's way of saying he believed a man deserved a second chance without having to say the words out loud. Thomas had turned into one of the best hands on the ranch. He was quiet now, where he used to be so eager to please. He was steady, where he used to be reckless. He carried himself like a young man who had learned the hard way how much one bad choice could cost, and who had been given the rare gift of living to tell the tale. "Every man deserves one chance to be a fool," Caleb told Hannah. "What matters is what they do with the second chance." Coop was still Coop. He was as quiet and capable and steady as the mountains on the horizon. But he called Hannah by her first name now, instead of ma'am. It was a tiny change, but it meant absolutely everything. Sam still chewed his tobacco and played his fiddle on Saturday nights. He called Hannah Doc with a kind of gruff fondness that was worth more than 1,000 fancy compliments. When a new hand hired on for the summer made some smart remark about a woman giving him orders, Sam set the boy straight with just 4 words. "She has earned it, son." Then one afternoon in June, Ruthie came to the ranch. She brought a box that she had been holding on to for 7 years. It was full of Margaret's things. There were letters, a small portrait that a traveling painter had done the year they first got to Montana. There was even a wildflower pressed between the pages of a Bible from Margaret's first spring there. It was faded, but you could still see a ghost of its color. "She would want you to have these," Ruthie said. "Not because you are her replacement. It is because you are her continuation. She started something here. You finished it." Hannah held the portrait with care. Margaret Mercer looked out at her with intelligent eyes and a hint of a smile. She held herself like a woman who was bracing for the next blow, but was determined not to flinch when it came. "I get it now," Hannah whispered to the portrait. "I understand why he fell for you. And I see why you wrote that letter, even knowing how dangerous it was. 'Cause some things are just worth fighting for, even if you have to do it by your lonesome." She took a breath. "But I learned something you never got the chance to. You do not have to fight alone. And that one little thing, well, it changes everything." It was morning, early summer, the kind of Montana morning that makes you see why folks would travel clear across the country to live in a place that spends half the year trying to kill them. The sky was a blue so deep it almost hurt to look at. The air was so pure it was like drinking water straight from a mountain spring. The mountains stood off in the distance, all purple and white, like they were keeping watch over the edge of the world. Hannah Mercer crossed the yard, heading for the big oak tree behind the house. She was carrying a bunch of wildflowers, lupine and Indian paintbrush, and those tiny white blossoms that grew all over the meadow below the south pasture. She had gathered them that morning before the sun came up, when the dew was still thick on the ground and the whole ranch was peaceful and quiet. The headstone beneath the oak tree was brand new. Caleb had carved it himself during the long winter, working by the light of a lantern out in the barn on nights when the cold was so bad there was nothing else to do. The carving was not professional, but it was careful, with letters cut deep into the stone by a man who knew that some debts can only be settled with time and care. Margaret Ann Mercer, a beloved wife, a brave woman. She fought for this land, 1845 to 1868. Hannah set the wildflowers down at the bottom of the stone. She knelt in the grass and spoke in a low voice, the way you talk to someone you have never met, but feel like you know from the space they left behind in the world. "You tried to keep this place safe long before I ever stepped foot on it. You wrote that letter, you held your ground, and they took your life for it, not because you were weak, but because you were a threat." She paused for a moment. The wind rustled the oak leaves above her, making a sound like soft breathing. "I almost made the same mistake you did. I almost tried to fight this whole world by myself. I spent my whole life thinking that was what it meant to be strong, toting the whole load myself and calling it being brave. when deep down it was just plain being scared. Scared that if I ever let somebody help, if I let somebody in close, they would see just how bone-tired I was, how frightened, how much I just wanted to hear someone say, "You do not have to do all this on your own." She touched the stone, gentle as could be. But I learned my lesson. Maybe you taught me. Maybe this land did. Or maybe it was the fellow we both ended up marrying, a man as stubborn and tight-lipped as they come, scared of his own temper, but also the finest man I have ever had the honor to know. I learned that being strong does not mean standing all by yourself. It means letting someone stand right there beside you. Even when you are terrified, they will see all the parts of you that are not brave in the slightest. She got to her feet, dusted the dirt off her knees. "I will look after him, Margaret. Not 'cause he needs it. He is the most capable man in this whole territory. But because every soul alive deserves someone who makes the choice to stay. He chose me, and I chose him right back. And I am choosing this land and this life and every hard, beautiful, and brutal thing that comes along with it." You rest easy now. You have not been forgotten, and the man who did you wrong will never bring harm to another soul again. Hannah turned away from the grave, and Caleb was right there, standing on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching her with those winter sky eyes of his that were not cold anymore, that had not been cold in a good long while. He did not say a word, did not want to break the moment. He just stood there, patient, solid, there, the same way he stood for everything, like a cedar post sunk deep in Montana soil, put there to hold up against any kind of storm. Hannah started walking toward him. She walked across the yard she swept clean every single morning, past the garden she had put in back in April, which was already showing neat green rows of beans and tomatoes, and the herbs she hung to dry from the kitchen ceiling. She walked along the fence she had fixed herself, the wire pulled taut and spaced just right, the way her granddaddy had shown her a whole lifetime ago in a different world. The porch steps felt solid under her boots. Caleb built them when he built the house, and they would likely stand for another 50 years, because that is just how Caleb Mercer built things. He built them to last. He offered her a cup of coffee. Their fingers just barely touched when she took it. The same simple touch that had happened 1,000 times since she had come here. But that little touch still meant the world. It held the weight of two souls who picked each other, knowing full well what they were getting into, and kept on picking each other every single morning, every single day, through whatever came their way. "Talking to Margaret," he said, "just telling her the truth, seemed like the only thing to do." And what truth is that? That her husband is a stubborn, secretive, and overprotective fella with one heck of a temper and does not know how to talk about his feelings. The corner of Caleb's mouth pulled up just a bit. That was about the closest he ever got to a smile before his first cup of coffee. "Anything else?" "That he is also the best man I have ever known, and that I am not going anywhere." He put his coffee cup down on the porch railing. He took her face in both of his hands. Those scarred, calloused hands that had wrestled a ranch out of this dirt, that had dug a grave in frozen earth, that had beat a man nearly to his end and had to learn the hardest way there is, that being violent was not the same thing as being strong. "I love you, Hannah Mercer. Not because you are useful, not because you saved this ranch, not because you are the toughest woman in all of Montana, though Lord knows you just might be." He took a breath. "I love you because you saw every last ugly piece of me in this life, and you did not run. You stayed put, and you fought. And you made this place into something Margaret would have been proud of. She would be proud of you too, Caleb. You finally let someone in. After all you have been through, that is the bravest thing you have ever done in your life." He kissed her then, slow and deep and sure. The kind of kiss that is not a start or a finish, but just keeps on going. The kiss of two people who know exactly who they married, the flaws and the scars and everything else, and would do it all over again tomorrow without a second thought. When they finally came apart, Hannah leaned against him, her head resting on his chest, his arm wrapped tight around her shoulders. They stood there on the porch together and just looked out at their ranch. A spring morning in Montana. the smell of sage on the wind and a meadowlark singing way off somewhere. The cattle were moving around in the close pasture. A little curl of smoke was rising from the bunkhouse chimney where Sam was likely burning the coffee, just like he always did. Liberty was standing by the corral fence, her ears pointed forward, waiting for Hannah like she did every morning. And beyond all that, there were the mountains, rising up against a sky so big, it made you understand why folks use a word like forever, even when they know it is not true. Because in a moment like this, standing on land you bled for, next to the one person you chose with your eyes wide open and a full heart, forever did not seem like some tall tale. It felt like a solemn promise. Hannah Mercer closed her eyes. She felt the warmth of the sun on her face and her husband's heartbeat under her hand, and the solid pine boards of the porch under her boots. She thought back to a night that felt like another lifetime. A storm back in Virginia. A desperate father practicing his sales pitch in the mirror. Choose the pretty one. And a man who rode right through that storm, walked into a rundown parlor, looked right past the beautiful girl sitting in the lamplight, and saw the shadow sitting in the corner, the one with dirt under her fingernails and a fire in her eyes, the one that nobody ever picked, the one that everyone always looked right through, the one who had been holding up a fallen-down world with nothing but her own two hands for so long, she had forgotten what it felt like to just stand up straight. He did not come in and save her. That was the part her father would have never understood. He just opened a door. And she was the one who had the grit to walk on through, and then she built a whole new life for herself on the other side. Not some storybook life, something better, something real, built out of honest work and hard truths and the kind of love that does not show up on a white horse in a thunderstorm but grows up slow and steady like new grass coming up through the ashes after a prairie fire, from the scorched earth of two broken folks who figured it was better to mend each other instead of just trying to fix themselves. She was not the pretty one. She was not the chosen one. She was not some damsel in distress. She was the one who walked right through the flames and came out the other side holding on to everything that truly mattered. Not because somebody saved her, but because she finally did the most rebellious thing a woman who was raised to be invisible could possibly do. She saved her own self, and then she let somebody love her for it. The wind swept down from the mountains, carrying the smell of sage and summer. And Hannah Mercer, standing right where she was always meant to be, she just smiled.